This video will talk about Niagara AX Security and some best practices for securing your Niagara AX environment. This is actually video part 1 of a 3-part series, fairly short series, that will just walk you through some of the security steps and help you to secure your station in the best way possible. Let's start by talking about Niagara's AX security model in general. It essentially boils down to who has access to what. If you think about it, a station has objects, components that you've created, files, histories, those kinds of things that are part of any natural station. We have users who need access to those things. So think about creating your objects and then try to categorize them into chunks that are meaningful to users. For example, you might have a user who's interested in lighting capabilities. So you might create a category called lighting that you can give users access to. So the object here is to take all of the objects in your system and categorize them in ways that are meaningful for your end users. We usually like to make some kind of a map, even a paper map that you draw out by hand, that says I have these kinds of users who need this kind of access to the system. So objects are put in categories. Then we create our users and give the users permissions within those categories. Pretty straightforward. Think of it as a user, what they need to do, and give them access to a category that contains objects so that the user then has access to those objects. Let's think about those users. Do they need to view a station and maybe not make any changes at all, but they'd like to be able to see it? Maybe they need to revise or edit the station information, so we need to give them write access to the system. Do they need to actually control equipment or silence alarms? Do they want to view histories or change schedules? Those kinds of things. The kinds of permissions that you can assign people are read, write, and invoke. Read is pretty straightforward. Obviously, if you wanted to see some data on the screen, you need to be able to read. Write, if you want to be able to change things, and invoke if you want to invoke commands like these to run the set command, those kinds of things. So these are the rights that the users will have within a category that allows them access to the objects within that category. When you assign those permissions, you can assign permissions to a user as an admin or an operator, or even both if you care to. Admin is pretty straightforward because it gives them access to everything. But operator sometimes is a little confusing. What does it mean to have operator access to a component? Well, look at the component slot sheet. You can see that we have the slot sheet for this particular component has all these properties. And I've highlighted this one here. Notice that in the flags column, this is what you care about, the O flag means that that user has operator access to that particular property. By default, objects have certain properties flagged with an O already, but it might be that you want to give access to even more of those properties, so you can do that. Just right-click the property and choose Config Flags, and it'll open up a dialog box called Config Flags, and then you just check on the operator access, and that'll add an O flag to any property in the system. So let's give you some examples of users and categories and permissions. In this example, we have some objects in the system. If you look on the left here, the services or drivers, lighting controller, runtime reset. And you might think about the users that might need access to those. You say, okay, well, some users have administrative access to the services and other users have just read access as an operator to the average value. So remember, we start by taking our objects and putting them in categories. We'll put services in general category, drivers in a general category, average value, lighting control, anything you like, just throw them in the general category. Objects can appear in more than one category. So for example, lighting control shows up in both general and the lighting categories. And then runtime reset is part of the HVAC in our example here. So we categorize all the objects on the left here, and then we think about our users and start giving them permissions to the categories. So Joe in this example is just an operator who only has read access. He can look at the system, but he can't make any changes to it. As an operator with access to the general category, then he can see all those objects over here who have a flag O in their flags properties that are part of the general category. Operator has access to lighting and HVAC in our example here. Bob might have the ability to read and write. If you give write, obviously read naturally comes along with that. So Bob has access to write to these categories, and so does Sally. But Bob cannot invoke things, can't run the set command, for example, but Sally can because she has invoke. And in our example here, just to bring it all around, George is an administrator. Admin naturally has access to everything. So those are the general concepts, but we'd like to show you a video of how you actually put this into play. So I'd invite you to look at the next in the series of videos, part 2 of 3. The video is called Niagara ProBuilder Security Best Practices, part 2 of 3. And then of course there's a part 3 of 3 as well. Thank you.